I'd like to welcome all of you who are members of the patrons and who are joining us as guests. This is the first lecture in a 4-part series, and we're just delighted to have all of you with us. And we're even more excited to give you a front row seat to hear Dr. Liz Lev, who is well known to those of you who are patrons, I know, as an incredible historian and lecturer and tour guide and savant about all things Vatican museums. But if you haven't had the opportunity to hear her in person before, you are really in for a treat today. So I'd like to welcome Liz. Hi, welcome Liz. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me. Good morning to all of you on Pacific time. For us, it's aperitivo time in Rome. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Elizabeth Lev. Everybody calls me Liz. I've been living in Rome for about 30 years, even during this rather difficult era of the pandemic. And I'm an art historian. And my specialization is Renaissance and Baroque, but over the course of the years, I became very, very specialized in the history of the Vatican museums. And that led me, one thing after another, to discover this period of Roman history that seems to be forgotten by the history of art. It's a very niche period in art history, the 18th century, the 18th going into the 19th century. And many years ago, when I was working on a project for the Vatican museums, we were writing a DVD called the Via Pulchritudinis, which was eventually presented to Pope Benedict XVI. I learned about this very, very important transformative era in the history of Rome, and specifically for the Vatican museums. And so I am delighted, I'm honored, I'm thrilled to be able to really unveil. This is the first time I've actually had time to work on it, thank you, pandemic. And so I'm very excited to be able to unveil for the first time these 4 talks that really go a little bit more in depth in a period that I'm quite fascinated with. And the period we're going to be talking about is the period of the Grand Tour. And so that's where we're going to begin with the Grand Tour in Rome. And so the Grand Tour, for again, those of you who that name sounds like maybe a sort of a long time on a touring bus. The Grand Tour is a period. It would be something that lasted sometimes 6 months up to a year. Basically, it began in the 18th century. And we began to see people coming to visit Rome for different reasons that weren't commercial, they weren't religious, and they weren't diplomatic. They were coming to Rome as tourists, as people who wanted to come and see the sights. And this is a tremendous change for the city of Rome when you consider who are the people who have been coming to the capital of Christendom, the heart of Christendom for all these years. They've been religious pilgrims. And so the customary sense during the Jubilee years, which I'm sure most of you, all of you know what a Jubilee year is, this moment of, started in 1300, every 25 years, there would be this possibility for pilgrims to come to Rome, visit the tombs of Peter and Paul, and have this cleansing experience of the plenary indulgence. And so this is what drew people to Rome, to walk in the footsteps of the saints, to confirm themselves in the faith, to be in the presence of the Holy Father, to see the tomb of Peter. That was what we were used to seeing in Rome, 1400, 1500, 1600, and then in 1700, everything changed. Not exactly overnight, but it did change. And we began to see this whole new type of visitor, which would need a very different type of reception. A great many of the grand tourists are Protestants. And what makes this period so fascinating is that a number of these grand tourists are the proto-secularists. These are going to be the first, this is the beginning, the first stirrings of the age of secularism that is coming to the heart of Christendom. And how is the church going to deal with this very new type of person walking through the streets of Rome? And that's what we're going to be talking about over the next 4 sessions, including the art and, most importantly, the way the Vatican museums became the front line response on the part of the papacy. So we're going to be looking at the Vatican museums, not from the eyes of the museum that Julius II put together in 1500. We're not looking at the Vatican museums as it is today in 2020. 2021. We are looking at the Vatican museums as it became, and I am not kidding you, the first modern museum in response to this very exciting new demographic. So what changed? What happened so that we had these new types of visitors? Well, what makes it interesting, it's a technological change. It's a dramatic difference. You are accustomed to thinking, okay, well, it's a long haul flight, whether it's commercial or private, you're used to getting on a plane, and then when you could, you got on a plane and you land. Maybe there's a stop, maybe there's two, but you end up in Rome. But let's think about the sheer difficulty of transport. Let's think about how important the history of transport is for the city of Rome. So a little note about the history of transport: not a lot changed in transport from the fall of the Roman Empire till about 1300s, about 1,000 years. Basically, transport stays the same. Wealthy people would be travel in litters, so they would be carried by people, or these sort of interesting little devices called a palanquin. It comes from a Sanskrit word, which means couch or bed. And it's basically a covered litter that has a lot of beautiful fabrics. And as you can see, it's attached to two horses. And obviously it was used to very good coordination with the horses. And it was used to transport only the wealthiest, the aristocrats, the most important people. So this was a form of transportation which existed for basically one type of person. There were very, very few of these traveling about. The palanquin eventually was transformed into a kind of early cart. But traveling by cart, it looks all very well and good when you first look at this picture here on the right, lovely image from an illustrated manuscript. The cart basically sat on axles. So as the wheels turned, the cart just jolted up and down in the axles. A little bit later, they began to add chains. They could create a sort of suspension system where there would be chains holding the box from above. But again, it was a very noisy and not very efficient way of moving people around. And on top of that, travel was always dangerous. Travel had a great many perils, in the sense of, in this picture here, if you look in the corner, you see the effects of brigandage, people who were waiting for these carriages that obviously were transporting wealthy people so that they could lay in wait and attack them as they traveled from one place to another. So people traveling for pleasure was really not very much something in mind, people had in mind. And then, of course, what happened if you had travel troubles? And these carts resting on these axles, they suffered a great deal from breakage. So you'd be in the middle of nowhere and your axle would break and your cart would dump you out into the middle of road, which famously happened to Saint Teresa of Avila. She had, if you will, cart trouble on one of her travels as she was founding her various convents. And when she landed on the ground, she looked up at the heavens, and apparently she said to God, "Lord, if this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few." So it's one of these wonderful little humoristic moments, but again, because of transportation. The Dickens kind of puts it very well. That sound, he describes the sound, the crack, 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 and the calling out of the coachman, with this wonderful, wonderful description of his trip to Italy, pictures of Italy. And so we get this sort of sense of the wooden wheels clattering across this sort of not very well paved roads, having to call out to assure that people weren't, in the middle of the way. So sort of noisiness, this ricketiness of travel. So what happens? What happens for the early period is that people don't really want to travel. So you'll find pilgrims who will travel by horseback if they're wealthy, or the famous site in Rome and in the Holy Land, the famous site of barefoot pilgrims, so beautifully rendered by Caravaggio in his lovely painting in Sant'Agostino in Rome of the Madonna of the Pilgrims, these sort of dirty bare feet, which were the hallmark of the pilgrim who got from point A to point B by walking. Pilgrimage really was a hardship. It was meant to be a penitential act. It was a way of showing one's love for God. It wasn't really meant to be, if the pilgrim got there and went to go see the Colosseum, it was very secondary to the real purpose of the trip. And then technology stepped up. And two hugely important things were developed at the very, very end of the 1600s that by the 1700s were sufficiently in circulation that people could start designing vehicles that could take long haul trips in comfort. Perhaps the most important thing, or the first most important thing, is the suspension strap, also known as the thorough strap. And this was a very heavy piece of leather. Look how strong that piece of leather is, which was hooked around a curved section in the frame of the carriage, and the chassis, the section where people sat, would be suspended along these curved sections of the frame by these leather straps. And then very, very shortly thereafter, to provide extra suspension, more stability, and to make it safer, they added the leaf spring, which you can see down here, this sort of interesting shaped oval spring, so that as the carriage came down, it would have the spring to send it back up. So you had these great new developments for the, I mean, these are the developments that they'll later use with automobiles, but it's these ideas that come to the fore and they start getting made regularly into carriages that make people think, well, wait a minute, I could take this carriage further than just to my country seat. And that's what begins this great new moment of international travel. The other thing that they needed were brakes. They also developed brakes in this period, which are fairly important. And so you can see here this interesting, very early type of brake, the leather strap that would pull this piece of metal against the wheel, as the wheels on both sides, in order to slow them down. It could be activated by a rod in the seat. So you see all these are things that are really being created. We take it for granted, the pulling up your handbrake or these different aspects of vehicles, but this is happening for the very first time. And suddenly the possibilities become endless. So we find people beginning to, so where the pilgrims were traveling in this much more, it's sort of a hardship mode, these new tourists are beginning to travel in what you might describe as style. And so as the carriages began to proliferate, you began to have people fixing roads. So roads there's a construction of roads, there's a creation of networks, there's the development of maps. And finally, there are the development of these way stations. With those of you who have been to Italy, you'll know the autogrill, basically. These wonderful places where people could stop and get a little food and rest for the night. And so the door was opened and people began to pour through, not unlike what we're expecting when eventually the pandemic restrictions lift, that sense of people rushing, and they're all rushing to Italy because this is the place they've read about. It's the common ancestor of all of these people. They want to see Italy. So the French came up with a very good way to resolve the problem of transport for more than one person. Obviously, the private carriage is very expensive. And the French are the first to create what will later be known in English as the stagecoach. So a transport vehicle for different people. They called it the diligence. And that was an interesting series of, it's an interesting form of travel because you're going to be in the diligence for a very long time with a group of people that are just brought together. And there are all kinds of really fun stories that are told by these tourists about what it's like to get into these carriages with people. And some of them want the windows open and some of them want the windows closed. Some of them don't want to sit outside. Some of them want to sit inside. They argue about where the seats are going to be. And then in the case of Cato Lowes Dickinson, who gives us a very vivid description of life in the diligence or in the stagecoach, he says that there was also the problem of personal hygiene that arose from time to time. And he describes his diligence as having the atmosphere of a cowshed impregnated with garlic. And one of the most interesting figures of the diligence is the man called the postilion. So the postilion was a character who had to accompany, he's not the one who's actually driving the stagecoach, so he's not sitting up at the top. He had to ride one of the horses, and his job was to navigate the horses and to make sure, whatever the weather was, that the road was clear. And these boots are very, very, very famous. You find allusions to them all the time because these are enormous boots, which the postilion wore with his shoes on. He put his shoes and his socks in them because they were meant to protect him against mud, freezing cold, whatever it was, his feet had to stay warm and protected. protected. And so if you ever see them, and they're in museums, you ever see them, they're like these big, huge, they look like casts. They're so large. And it was really the symbol of the person who was most responsible for the safe transport of the diligence. Now, the diligence was not a particularly efficiently, it was inexpensive, but it was not a very fast way to travel. Some of these, as they got bigger and bigger, could weigh up to 10 tons, and they moved very slowly. A diligence of the one you see right here, it traveled maybe about 18 to 30 miles a day. So if it's 870 miles to get from Paris to Rome, that's a pretty long trip. And so you can understand why the Grand Tour was something for which people had to slot out 6 months to a year. If it takes you a month to get there, of course, enjoying the ride, but if it takes you a month to get there, you want to be sure you get what you can out of the time you've invested. Now, obviously, the equivalent to the private plane in those days was the private carriage. And there were the first of the grand tourists all come by private carriage. As a matter of fact, they don't come by one private carriage. They come by 2 or 3 private carriages, because there was one for the actual lord and his family. There was one for the luggage. There was usually one for servants, children. And this also required not only the 3 carriages, but it required special riders whose job it was to go ahead and to make sure that the roads were safe and continued. And so you make sure you didn't come to some sort of giant pothole where the carriage could not be knocked over, and to go and warn the hostel up ahead, or the osteria up ahead. The family was coming, to make sure the rooms were ready. So you had to actually have someone who accompanied you, who knew the road, who knew how to get you there, and went ahead to set up everything for you from day to day. It's kind of like when you take those bicycle tours where you're on the bicycle, and then there's the group that goes ahead and prepares everything for you. So when you get there at the end of the day on your bicycle, everything is ready and waiting for you. So it's very, very, very luxurious form of travel. And these carriages were so special that by the end of the 18th century, women were starting to buy their own carriages. So not only did the Lord have his carriage, the lady wanted her own carriage, and women were beginning to contemplate doing international travel in their carriages. And so in the ultimate magazine, the Vogue magazine of the late 18th, early 19th century, there is a whole discussion of what the fashionable lady is driving. And so she says, it's not the poor food or the lack of sleep that makes travel unpleasant, it's the lack of space. And a well-appointed lady's carriage should have shelves for novels, so you can while away the time reading. You should have a rack above for musical instruments. And then you'll have to have compartments for cosmetics and perfumes and hats as you get out. And this was actually in this wonderful magazine. It went on for over a century, the Journal des Dames et des Modes, where you find what the well-dressed lady playing badminton, what the best badminton outfit was for 1820, as well as what the well-dressed lady would be wearing on her grand tour. So it's very, very fun to see these things. The other type of travel, and this was the one that was really the most popular, I dare say it was probably the most used of all travel to Italy, was the vetturino. The vetturino, it's like the early renting a car and driver, basically. And this was a person who owned the carriage, and he owned the horses, and he was very used to the route. And so you would pay, this is a very good system for people to not have surprises economically on the trip. You paid the vetturino a set sum for your journey in. So you would pick it up, whether it was in London or Geneva or wherever you were going to pick up your vetturino. You would pick up your vetturino, you would pay an agreed sum, and then he would take you all the way into, generally Rome was the destination, and he would provide for, out of that sum you paid him, he would provide for your meals and your lodgings, et cetera, et cetera. Now, It was a good way to make sure that you didn't have to think about anything. Once you got in the carriage, you didn't have to worry about where you're going. It was the job of the vetturino to take you, if you were stopping in Parma, if you had to stop overnight in Parma, he would make sure you saw all the sights you needed to see. So he kind of took care of you. He was really like a very, very good a driver who might take you around Italy today. The only problem is that every now and then you would find the vetturino who would find this kind of conflicting interest. And Leigh Hunt here, who was traveling in 1821, was a very successful writer in England. He was editor of several magazines. He was the man who introduced Keats, John Keats, to Percy Shelley. And so he was very hooked in with a lot of these very sort of high-flying, important people. But he did marry and have 10 children. So the fact of the matter is he really couldn't afford to spend as much on travel as, for example, his friend Lord Byron. And so on his way down to Italy, he traveled in the diligence. And on his way back, he decided he would never do the diligence again, and he would spring for the vetturino. And he has this wonderful little description down below about how the vetturino has these conflicting interests, how he wants to please you so that you'll send your friends, but he's trying to make the most out of the money you've given him. So he's occasionally tempted to take kickbacks, or even better yet, the food becomes scarcer and scarcer as you travel along. And so he tells people in his little diary of his trip, he tells other people to make sure you're very firm with the vetturino at the beginning, and then you should have no problem for your entire trip. So sort of tips on how to make this long journey. Now, as I'm leaving them, I'm beginning to move out of the carriage question. I couldn't leave you without telling you the coolest carriage ever constructed, which is the military carriage of Napoleon. He had several different ones, but this is the celebrity ride to end all celebrity rides. He rode this carriage into battle. He had it custom made. And when he was defeated at Waterloo, it had a little secret trap door apparently. So while they were shooting and stabbing at the front, he got out the trap door with none of his stuff. He just escaped with the clothes he had on his back and ran away. And the carriage became part of the war booty on the part of the Prussians. And this thing is an amazing thing. It's just so much fun. I couldn't resist putting it in and sharing it with you. You can see his little jacket here in the front. It's in the London Piccadilly Museum. And it's just kind of cool because it looks on the outside like virtually any other carriage, except there's a little part here behind the driver, which you can't see very well in this picture, but you can see in the drawing, which extended forward. It had like a little extra, it had like a boot or a trunk. And in the trunk, there are two things. One is, you can see in this picture, his silver setting. But the other thing that's actually really interesting was it had a bed that could be folded up and taken out, so that inside his carriage, in a matter of minutes, they say, they could unfold this bed. So it's like the pod in like the first class in the airplane. So like suddenly the carriage becomes this sleeping pod. And it had, if you look in the back here, you can see a little vase, which was sort of an early bathroom. And he had a writing desk where he could work. He had bottles, I believe they found in there bottles of aged rum and a very fine Malaga wine. And they also found, just in case you're curious, an old army uniform which had hundreds of diamonds sewn into the pockets. Apparently Napoleon really lost everything at Waterloo. At any rate, it was a bulletproof carriage. The outdoor panels were bulletproof. It had little secret sword compartments. It was the carriage to end all carriages. And I find it very entertaining to realize how much Napoleon paid attention to his own transport. And that brings me to how this connects up with the Vatican museums. The reason why I ended up on this, what I find fascinating voyage of discovery, is because of this very underappreciated corner of the Vatican museums, which is called the Carriage Museum. It was opened by Paul VI in 1963. It's a wonderful, it's a sort of an underground garage. It's cool, by the way, in the summertime. A lot of the times I used to take people on tours on a hot summer day. I'm like, let's go to the Carriage Museum. Or sometimes I went simply because it was crowded. Everybody's going to the Sistine Chapel. Let's go to the Carriage Museum. But what I really loved about it was that whole history of transport that I just told you, we could follow follow through this museum. And so you can see the thurowstrap, and you see the leaf spring, and you see the palanquins, and you go through this really amazing history of the popes moving around Rome. Just keeping with the Napoleon theme, this is one of the most beautiful carriages they have in that collection. It was made in 1868 by Gaetano Peroni. And if any of you are Ferrari fans, you will know that the famous Pininfarina is the man who signed some of the most iconic chassis of Ferrari. And Gaetano Peroni was the Pininfarina for carriage making, and his signature is actually on the chassis. And it was made for the cousin of Emperor Napoleon III. It was a gift from his cousin. And so this sort of very, very beautiful, stately wagon that would take him through the city of Rome. When he died, he bequeathed it to Leo XIII, because for all the flash and dash of the carriage, he was actually a very humble and simple man who gave a lot of service to the poor. The most spectacular thing in the museum is, of course, the Berlino. That's the description of this type of carriage, this kind of enclosed carriage, the Berlino of Grande Gala. So this great gala for huge occasions, ordered by Leo XII in 1825, completed by Gregory XVI in the 1830s. He made some adjustments, and again signed by Gaetano Peroni, the studio of Gaetano Peroni. He started this one, and the studio built the other one. The fascinating thing about this one is that it's, first of all, it's of a luxuriousness which is completely over the top. It is a work that was, it was 12,500 scudi, which is almost impossible to translate into dollars, but it was a price tag that was actually noted because of the fact it was the most over the top amount of money spent on a vehicle. And what this is a movable throne room. The function of this object is that it is a kind of movable throne room. And one of the major adjustments that Gregory XVI did is he removed the place for the coachman to sit, right? What is missing in this coach? It is missing the place for the coachman. And so actually the coachman had to ride the horse. Two coachmen had to ride the horses in order to navigate the carriage, because what the Pope wanted was this image of these adorable little putti holding up the crown. So as the carriage came in, the putti were holding up the crown. It was not used very often, I must say. It was something that was very rarely taken out, only on the most special occasions. But a great many grand tourists saw this arrive regularly on March 25th, which is the feast day of the Assumption, which is when the Pope would come to Santa Maria sopra Minerva, which is this wonderful Dominican church. It's now 700 years old. And it has in it a chapel dedicated to the Annunciation. And there was a confraternity called the Confraternity of the Annunciation. So on March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation, we have lots of accounts of the grand tourists who happen to be in the area and see the papal carriage pull up. And the white feathers on the top would tell you that the Pope was in it. So they would put white feathers on the top to tell you it was in service for the Pope, just like the Swiss guards wear the red plumes in their helmets when they're going to be doing service for the Pope. And so when the Pope alighted in order to continue a custom that went back to the 15th century of distributing dowries to the poor girls of Rome at Santa Maria sopra Minerva. So this kind of lovely little thing that the grand tourists happen to see if they happen to be in Rome on March 25th. And then that's different from a traveling carriage. I'm just going to show, this is a traveling carriage from the museum. And this particular carriage is interesting because it was used by Pius IX when he was returning from Naples. He had to escape to Gaeta in his papacy when the Republic of Rome was declared. But this is very, very different from the carriage you saw for Luigi Napoleone and the one for the Grand Gala. And the reason is the headlights. So you can see the wheels are sturdier, the use of headlights. And this has a conceit that is one of my favorite things, absolutely. The door handles are little papal keys. So they designed the door handles. They look like the two crossed keys in the tiara, which is kind of the coolest vanity plate I've ever seen. And while we're on the subject, just before I close out the question of transport, I just want to mention that Pope Pius IX is the man who added train travel to the Papal States. That will not be so much a part of our lecture series, but it is interesting to know that hard on the heels of the stagecoaches and the work in transport, hard on the heels come trains. And Gregory the 16th, who was the predecessor of Pius IX, hated trains. He looked at, they showed him the project of the train, and all he saw was a scarring of the countryside. Oh my gosh, you're going to cut into the countryside. They emitted all this black smoke and black steam. And Gregory the 16th solemnly swore, there will never be trains in the Papal States. He called them, instead of the chemin de fer, the iron road, he called them the chemin d'enfer, the road to hell. So no capes, no trains, no trains. Blessed Pope Pius IX, what does he do? The first thing he does when he's elected, puts trains all through the Papal States. And this was his personal train car, which is an amazing museum in Rome called the Centrale di Monte Martini. It's a very little known museum. It's out towards St. Paul's, outside the walls, and it's inside one of the very old electrical generating plants in Rome, where they put ancient art next to these very modern steam engines. And then they have a special room where they keep the train car of Blessed Pope Pius IX. And here you see him traveling in his open train car. Remember, this is like an open throne. The carriage for the Grand Gala, even his train car, it's so that the Pope will be visible. It was very important when they designed these things, they have a throne. So the Grand Gala carriage had a throne, the train had a throne, so that the Pope would be elevated and extremely visible, so that everybody would be able to see the Vicar of Christ, to see the successor of St. Peter, and to be able to receive his blessings. A very sort of beautiful image. And then, just so I can convince you the next time you go, you want to go to the Carriage Museum. This is the first car ever to leave Vatican City State. Was made by the Detroit company of the Graham Page brothers. And in 1929, this limo was given to the Pope, and he used it. And then Mercedes gave a limo, and then Citroën gave a limo. And eventually they favored the Mercedes limo. But on July 19th of 1943, when the famous bombing happened in San Lorenzo, Pius XII hopped in the Mercedes and started to go race across town so he could go be among the people. 1,400 people were killed in that bombing. And so racing across town, and as he was racing across town, what happened? His Mercedes broke down. So they pulled out the old Graham Page, the old car from Detroit, not as pretty, but completely functional. And it picked him up and it took him to the square. And he is standing on the running board of that Graham Page in what is the most iconic and most beautiful picture of his papacy, when he went among the crowds to express his sorrow and to offer his blessing for the people who had just been bombed in the Second World War. And then finally, the last treasure of the museum is this Pope Mobile. You can see the whole history of the Pope Mobiles in there. But of course, this one has a very special meaning for all of us, because this is the vehicle in which on May 13th, 1981, John Paul II was shot. And so it's very intimately connected to that great moment of suffering in the church. Now, that takes care of the first part of our story. Now we go to the most fun. Where are we going to go once we've got all of these vehicles? Well, all roads lead to Rome. And so here you see the many, many different routes, many different places that people came from. This was the grand tourists were departing from all over, all of them interested in coming to the city of Rome. They went from crowned heads of Europe. So you have Duke Leopold of Tuscany, together with his brother, who was Emperor Joseph. He's the Holy Roman Emperor, Joseph II, in this amazing portrait by Pompeo Battoni. And in our next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about this portrait artist, who is very, very important in this era. But it's a very interesting portrait. Look at how these people have themselves shown. This is like a photograph to remember their grand tour. But you'll notice the Holy Roman Emperor sits with the Castel Sant'Angelo, a fortress over one shoulder, and St. Peter's over the other shoulder, which pretty much impossible to get that view. He has the image of Rome. It looks like his arm is sort of perched on the knee of the city of Rome. It's a very authoritative image of someone who is not the king of Rome. And as a matter of fact, we'll find out that there was a lot of tension between Pius VI and Joseph II in the course of the years. Gustav III of Sweden, the Protestant king of Sweden, came to Rome in 1783, and he attended Mass at St. Peter's, Christmas Mass at St. Peter's, in this incredibly beautiful painting. I just think it's such a lovely image of the light pouring into St. Peter's, the reverence of the Swiss Guards. It's almost like photography. And that's a very interesting thing that happens in art in the 18th century. Trying to capture the reality of these experiences, art moves very, very close to to what photography does. Then afterwards, Gustav got a very special tour, but that's just a preview for what we're talking about next week. One of the most significant figures, someone who will return again and again, even though he lived not a very long time in our story, is Johann Joachim Winckelmann. Winckelmann, the Vatican Museums celebrated his life. Actually, it was 2 years ago. They had a big celebration of his life. Winckelmann was the man who came to Rome in 1754. He was German, and in order to come and obtain work in Rome, he converted to Catholicism. It was not apparently a very real conversion. He apparently wrote letters to his friends saying, don't worry, I'm just doing this for a job. But his love of Rome, his love of the collection of antiquities in the Vatican, his love of antiquity, it was such that for him, that was his real religion. Whatever he had to do it, that was fine. And so we see the young, idealistic, dreamy Johann Winckelmann coming to Rome, when he will write. For art historians, we always have to kind of lower our voice and sort of speak in this way because he's the father of art history. And when he writes the history of antique art and he gives us this understanding of a cyclical nature of art, it's the cornerstone of how we do art history even today. And it happens in Rome by this man who is working in and around the most important collections in Rome. Unfortunately, he died very young. He died at the age of 50. And we can see that towards the end of his life, or towards a certain part of his life, he started to get increasingly sort of eccentric in his behavior. And he was killed in rather unfortunate circumstances in Venice. And that ended this rather sort of incredible life. So I find it amazing to see the difference between the two men in just a short space of time, from 1754 to 1758. And then we have another wonderful visitor. Music by Thomas Tallis, Allegri, music by Allegri. It is a piece of music that was not handed down orally from choir master to choir master, and played only during the Good Friday, Holy Saturday period of the year. Mozart went to this ceremony, listened to the music, transcribed it at age 13, and went back the next day, made changes. But it was one of the things that was his calling card to Rome, this incredible ear for music, in which he tremendously impressed the Pope and indeed received a papal audience. Goethe is one of the most beautiful characters of the Grand Tour. He is the man who gives us this line that I think resonates with all of us, especially in these days. We are all pilgrims who seek Italy. He wrote this wonderful description of his time in Italy called The Italian Journey. Magnificent poet. He's going to pop up several times also in assistance to some of the artists who will work here. But that the man who really is in many ways the father of great travel writing was really was Goethe. And so not only was he a writer, he's the author of these stories of Faust, but this wonderful sentimentality, this way of looking at what it means to visit these ancient civilizations, what it means to have this kind of experience that he so beautifully evokes in his writings, which is really, again, a wonderful book as you're preparing to come to Italy again. Reading Goethe is a very enriching experience. And then we have the Baron Vivant Denon, who is, I didn't use very many French in this one. There are quite a few French who are coming into Rome in this period, but in the interest of time, I chose only one. Rousseau was here when he was young, and Montesquieu is very famous. But the one I'm most interested in is Baron Vivant Denon, and you'll know him as visitors to the Louvre, because you know that one of the wings of the Louvre is named after him. The Denon wing, which contains Italian art, is in his honor. And during the course of these 4 lectures, you will find out why. So he's a man who came to Rome, loved art, loved to see him studying the works of Nicolas Poussin, but later on we'll find that his love of art leads him to some rather problematic situations for the city of Rome. Then we have the Brits, and I wanted to just put in this picture because, again, next week I'm going to be talking to you more about portraits that the grand tourists will have done of themselves. And this is actually the mother of all grand tour portraits. I'll be talking about it next week, but just to kind of hint to you that one of the great art forms that takes on a whole new meaning is the art of portraiture. And this Sir Wyndham, Catchable Wyndham, imagine that name, is one of the very first grand tourists. Look at the date when he's here. So he's one of the first to make this journey. He finds Pompeo Battoni, who really produces this portrait, which is extraordinary. And on top of everything else, it's in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So you don't actually have to travel to Italy to see it. And next week, we'll discuss it a little bit more in depth to talk about how portraiture is used in this period. And then we have, among the great Brits, we have the beautiful poets like Lord Byron. And I think Lord Byron is the man who gave us the most evocative sense of what the Colosseum, but seeing these enormous monuments mean to us. So he writes of the Colosseum, a ruin, yet what a ruin. From its mass, walls, palaces, half cities have been reared. Yet oft the enormous skeleton ye pass, and marvel where the spoil could have appeared. Hath it indeed been plundered, or but cleared? These descriptions of the Colosseum by night. Again, we'll be talking about that a little bit more next week. We have John Keats and Percy Shelley. Shelley, who writes, "Go thou to Rome, at once the paradise, the grave, the city in the wilderness, where its wrecks like shattered mountains rise, and flowering weeds and fragrant copses dress." So we look over here. This is actually something you can still visit in Rome. The Keats and Shelley house is immediately next to the Spanish Steps. The Spanish Steps had just been built. Again, part of the grand tour reaction. The Spanish Steps had just been built. And so this house that would belong to Keats and Shelley are next to what is one of the coolest, newest monuments in Rome. And it's preserved in the interior as best they could in order to really evoke what it was like at the age of these 2 grand tourists. And what are they coming to do? What is the point of this trip? Well, there are 2 points. One is visiting the antiquities, and 2 discoveries make Italy the place to go. Pompeii, rediscovered in 1739, Herculaneum, 1749. The grand tourist will make a point of leaving Rome to go to Naples to see this ancient city emerging from the ground, a city very interesting for the secularists who are coming to Rome. This idea of the reemergence of this great lost Roman Republic, just as people are thinking, what do we need religion for? And then we have what was in Rome, the #1 attraction in the early part of the 18th century. The Villa Albani. Today it's known as the Villa Torlonia. It is the hardest site in Rome to get into. It's incredibly difficult. It was built by Carlo Marchioni for Cardinal Albani from 1746 to 1767. You can see his name here. It is stunning, and to go and visit it, you feel like you are seeing it in the 18th century. It's up on the Via Salaria, behind that kind of busy area right outside the park, the Borghese Park, and you go through this gateway and you step literally into another world. And Alessandro Albani, who died in 1789, here is 1779. Look at these halls. Look at, they're filled with these amazing statues. Everywhere you looked, there was one masterpiece after another, and that is the exhibition that's been going on at the Capitoline Museums here in Rome. The famous Torlonia marbles, which come out of the Albani collection. He was turning his house at Cardinal Albani into a new Parnassus, as you would describe it. Parnassus, he had this painting done, this fresco executed by Anton Raphael Mengs for the great gallery of his statues, where you see Apollo surrounded by the muses. I think we're supposed to think Apollo as Cardinal Albani, but he's obviously taking the void that has been left by the Vatican. Raphael's Parnassus, which was painted under Julius II, who had opened that museum, opened it up to artists, opened it up to thinkers, to humanists, but that museum was closed in the 16th century. It was very, very difficult to get into in the 17th century, and very, very hard at the beginning for the Grand Tour. But all the Grand Tourists, despite the fact that they had a new Parnassus in the Albani, they were all coming. They all wanted to see one thing. At the top of every list of every Grand Tourist, there was one door they wanted to step behind. The greatest collection of antiquities, the works done by the most brilliant artists of the Renaissance, it was the museums, the Vatican museums they wanted to visit. But the Vatican museums had been shut by Pius V. It was a question of kind of finding the right person who could get you in the back door, but not a real organized museum experience. And that is what we're going to be talking about next week, when the Pope looks at these secular visitors who are so interested in the antiquities, who are so interested in the world of the pagan Romans, the Romans who, according to the Grand Tourist, didn't really need religion. And how are the popes going to welcome these people in the Vatican museums, but still remind them of the truth that they organize their lives around of Christianity. And that's where we're going to go with our next trip. So thank you very, very much. And I hope you found that, I hope you learned something new, as I think this is lots of fun new stuff.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. That was terrific. And I think reinventing the wheel could not be a more apt title. How terrific is that? So we have a lot of questions that are coming in, and we'll take as many of those as we can. So just a reminder to everybody, if you've got a question, just type it in that Q&A box and we will ask it live. So the first one is about, what do you do when you get to Rome? So after these long journeys, where are people staying in Rome in the 18th century? Are they building new hotels? Are they private residences? What's going on with that?
So yes, that's part of what next week is going to be about, what happens once you actually get here. And yes, the answer is yes, they are building hotels are beginning to open. And there are residences, kind of like Airbnbs. You can rent apartments, and you can rent parts of palaces. And you're going to find that, however, the Grand Tourists, they focus in on a very specific part of the city. Like there's one place where they want to be, and they don't really want to be, in Trastevere or places like that. And we'll see how their insistence on residing in a specific part of Rome is actually going to affect how that part of Rome looks today.
Going back a little bit to our sort of pre-Grand Tour Rome visitors. So, you mentioned pilgrims visiting the tomb of St. Peter. Was that open for tours in the way that, we see it today beneath the floor of the Basilica?
So people who, yes, we have a very, very different and very, very fortunate, I mean, really it's providential, the experience that we have when we go to the Tomb of St. Peter. The Tomb of St. Peter was really not rediscovered until the 1940s. It was actually, to be precise, it was 1939 when they were trying to put the tomb of Pius XI in the grottos. And in lowering the floor to make room for Pius XI's tomb, they found the roof of one of the buildings in what would eventually become what I think you guys know as the Scavi. And so during this rather difficult period, including a Nazi occupation, they excavated this area. So our experience of the Tomb of St. Peter is very, very new and very, very different. What there was, however, at the time was the Confessio. So when you walk up in St. Peter's and you get to the place where Bernini's canopy is, you have that sort of semicircular shape that leads down to the area in front of the Tomb of St. Peter. And that was built in with the second basilica. So when they rebuilt the Basilica of St. Peter's, that was already there. And pilgrims who came before that, before the rebuilding of St. Peter's in 1506, Gregory the Great in 590 had built a kind of annular crypt. So what happened is you took those stairs down. So if you know St. Peter's, you have the 4 statues with the stairs. There would have been a much smaller, the church was much smaller then, but you would have gone down to a lower level where you could have walked around a semicircle. And there was one point where the semicircle backed on to part of Peter's tomb. So it wasn't quite the same experience, but you really, I mean, pilgrims would come and they could, drop their pieces of cloth through a grate and make a contact relic from the dirt of Peter's tomb.
We've got a couple of questions about women who are coming on the Grand Tour. Did they travel on their own? Were they coming as part of an entourage? What were the sort of do's and don'ts around that for women who are traveling?
So lecture number 3 is all about the women. I love this topic. But yes, as a preview, you're not really, going alone is not a good plan. So they will go with other women or chaperones, a little bit like you saw in Room with a View. There's some really interesting, sometimes they'll be accompanied by parents. Some of the more famous ones are accompanied by parents. And then as we move a little bit through the 19th century, as you move into the 19th century, and I'm going to go, for this lecture on women, I'm going to go into this because I think it's amazing. You get to the mid-19th century and women, particularly American women, are coming over, and they're coming over by themselves. The sisters are doing it for themselves. And so they come, they set up, and they work here. They set up here to work, and they're artists. And so it's an amazing community. I can't wait to talk about them. That's 2 weeks from now. And we'll talk about the women of the Grand Tour, but even more interestingly, the women who came here to really make a career in 1850, 1860.
That's going to be really fun. Do we have a sense of what the population of Rome was sort of at the beginning of this whole Grand Tour process?
So the population of Rome was hovering somewhere between, it sort of hovers around 50, 75, 100,000, kind of depending on various tensions that are happening in the Papal States. But generally Rome is about 100,000, little bit less.
Okay. Well, we've got a couple of museum-specific questions. One that I love is, are there miniatures of the carriages available for sale in the gift shop at Carriage Museum?
I think there are.
That's fantastic.
I am pretty sure, because that's like a relatively new thing. But I remember I was sitting there kind of, standing around. I don't know, the museums have been closed forever, so I'm functioning on distant memory right now. But I remember I was standing there and I was looking at it, and I was like, is that a miniature of one of the carriages? I sort of have this memory of going, oh, that's kind of cool. And then someone distracted me. But yeah, I think there are. Yay!
That's
I'm so glad everybody wants to buy them. I'll go find out for you. There's going to be opening this week. I'll go find out for you.
Fantastic. Yeah, there's going to be a rush on the Carriage Museum once we can.
I'm so excited.
Well, and I think we've got time for just about one more question. Just loads of people expressing their thanks in the Q&A. So certainly we'll pass all that along to Liz. But you mentioned that in the 18th century, getting to the Villa Albani was just the real hot ticket, and it still is. It's still very difficult to get into the whole experience. So can you tell us how to do it? What's the secret? How do you get those tickets?
The Albani requires, last time I went to the Albani, I wrote letters sending resumes of every single person that was coming with us. There's an administration of the Torlonia. It's now called Torlonia, and it's the administration of the Torlonia. And you have to write them a really long letter by explaining why you are the only people in the world who should go visit their collection. And what's more, you have to be prepared for them. Like, it's going to be very much on their terms. So the Torlonia marbles being on display for every single Roman has been the biggest deal in the world, because we all know that they've got these amazing works in there, but no one could ever see them. It was really, really hard to visit. And so this exhibition at the Capitoline Museum, every Roman has been going over and over and over again, because we don't know we're going to see it again. So, but basically with the Torlonia, it's not money. I think last time I don't even think they charged us. They just, it's not money. It's just they just only the few, the proud.
Well, thank you so much for such a fascinating lecture. I know we're all really excited for next week as well. And so just a reminder to all of you who are with us, please join us next week at exactly the same time. We will, of course, be recording and circulating these lectures afterwards. So if for some reason you can't make it, maybe you get one of those hot tickets to the museum, you can always see any of these lectures when you missed or rewatch part of today on our YouTube channel, California Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican Museums. Also, just a reminder to all of us that this series is presented free of charge, but the patrons exist as an organization to support the Vatican Museums. That's restoration work and the preservation of the many, many, many incredible treasures from around the world, from throughout history, that are housed in the museums. As Liz mentioned, the museums in Rome, and especially the Vatican, have been closed and opened and closed again, and it's been a difficult year, like it has for everyone, of course. So if you are so moved, a gift in any amount to support the work of the patrons and to help sustain the museums is greatly appreciated. You can give to the COVID-19 Relief and Support Fund at any time at californiapatrons.org/donations. And so with that, it just remains for me to once again thank Liz and to thank all of you for being with us, and we'll see you next time.